So we talked a little bit about this particular piece of cover art, which I think is a fantastic example of a cover. Would there be other cover art or interesting pieces associated with this book? Would there be a back cover to this book, for example?
Well, Brandon, as you can see on this one, and it was pretty standard that they would always publish the same ad every month on the comic book, so they would just reprint this. I'm sure that there is an original of this somewhere that somebody
Gumby
can collect
Folkyard,
if you like Gumby.
Yeah.
But for the most part, no. But they did do what they would call a wraparound cover. So let me actually show you one of those, and it's actually, you can see it's much bigger because it's twice the size of this cover. This is one that was done for a comic called X-Men Classics. And so in this case, although the front cover is this part over here, you actually do have the back cover that goes along over there. Drawn is one piece of art. You'll notice in this case, they decided to add the logo later, so it was not actually pasted onto the artwork here. But you know, that sometimes you find that, sometimes you don't. Some people, you also see that when people are displaying their art, they will have a logo made up. And they'll add it to this to make it look like the actual publication itself. Some collectors
like on
prefer
an acetate as a separate layer?
Yeah, they make it after the fact, and that's personal preference. Some people prefer, and in my case, I love to see the extra art that got covered up by the logo.
Yeah.
But some people actually prefer to make it look exactly as it did on the when they hit the stands, and that's what they remember.
I assume it was less common for a book to have a wraparound cover than a standard?
Yes, and this was what they call direct sales, and you can tell from the box up here that it had the M that this was, and it doesn't have that UPC box. The UPC box was used for scanning at the grocery store or wherever it may have been. In this case, the wraparound cover was done because this was a deluxe book. There's no ads throughout the publication on this. It was all art all the way through.
I see.
And they charged a premium price for that, but they would sell this directly at comic book stores. And so you wouldn't find it necessarily on the newsstand.
Interesting, yeah. And so is a wraparound cover going to be inherently more or less valuable than a standard cover, or it just depends on the content?
I think it depends on the content. A cover that somebody really loves, again, you don't have any control over the size of it. And just because of, I think in general, the larger the size, that's more impressive to people because it's more of a showpiece on the wall. Yeah. So it's great to have this.
Yeah.
So I think you give me a choice between having a smaller cover and a larger cover, I'll take the larger cover any day.
Yeah.
With that being said, if this was, not a piece that I necessarily cared for, I wouldn't pay as much for it.
Yeah.
So.
And so did this piece also have a separate pencil and inker in the same way the last cover that we looked at?
It does, and actually the penciler in this case is the same, which is Mike Zeck, and so it was there, but in this case the inker was Tom Palmer.
Okay.
And so Zeck and Palmer, actually there were 3 issues of this, ironically Tom ended up with the 3rd cover and Mike ended up with the 1st and 2nd cover. And I was able, to track these down. I actually have all 3 of them.
Oh, great.
But it took me probably 15 years or so to actually find all of them from the day that I remember actually Mike bringing this to a show back in 1986.
The collector's journey. So let me ask you a production-related question. I see here in the artwork we have some very, very fine line work that obviously is not done by hand, right?
Yes.
You've got some sort of grid of dots there and these very fine lines, which I assume relate to trying to generate certain textures within the final printed look. Tell me about the production process as it relates to those graphic elements.
Yeah, no, it's good to note those, and if people can see those. This, and there are different tones that you're going to see around this, and this is very typical for Tom Palmer when he inked a book. This is called Zipatone, I guess is the common. That's actually it's kind of like Charmin. It's actually a brand name that a lot of people will call it. There was another one called Letraset that was also used. Yeah. They were tones that they knew what they would look like when they got printed. And so they would be at varying degrees, 50%, 70%, 30%. So the inker was trying to get across here some shading. Instead of using pencil or other things that were going to be, you didn't exactly know how they would turn out if they were going to be printed, they would commonly use this Zipatone, if you want to call it that, to shade different areas. But you'll see that it came in many different shapes and sizes, and the Zipatone that was used up here may be different than the Zipatone here. This is a gradated Zipatone that moves from white to black that he would also put on this. But what they would do is actually place it on the artwork, cut it out, and then remove the excess that they didn't need, and then burnish it down, which is basically using something to actually make sure it adhered to the artwork. And years later, it actually is still present. They did a good job of burnishing this down. Sometimes you'll see this fall off though, because it it had a glue backing to it, and sometimes it would turn brown, sometimes it would just fall off in and of itself, but in this case it actually held up very well.
And how many pieces of comic art would feature some of these paste-on elements? Is this a common thing?
It was common, I would say, between the late 1960s and in the 1980s, you see a lot of this Zipatone. It was sort of in vogue at the time.
Yeah.
Early 1960s art, you didn't see this. They didn't add it. But I'd say in today's artwork, you don't see it as much because a lot of the tonal qualities are added when they color it digitally.
Yeah.
And so I don't think you see quite as much of this, but there are some artists that probably still like to use something like this.
Interesting. And so the process of actually generating this art, obviously the pencil work goes down first, and then the ink, and then the Zipatone, or Zipatone before ink, or that's all sort of...
Usually you would see ink and then Zipatone, because you see in this case, you can see where they actually covered up the inked area with the Zipatone, and you usually would see the black would actually come all the way through, even though the Zipatone is on top of it.
Yeah.
But a lot of times they would do that, and in some cases they would actually add highlights. In this case, you see also some white specks on here, which is whiteout.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that was correcting some of the inking mistakes that were made, where either the line wasn't clean or whatever it is. Sometimes they would use that for effect, and sometimes they would actually use whiteout on top of the Zipatone to add even more of an effect to it as well.
Interesting. And so things like the whiteout, the Zipatone, is any of that affecting the value of this piece, or because it's one of one, the condition, things like that, far less relevant? It's just more about what the piece is inherently.
I would say it's probably more the latter, which is it is a one of a kind. You have to accept the baby, as it is.
Yeah.
But that being said, there are certain pieces that maybe they have a lot of paste ups or they have a lot of whiteout, that frankly it actually impacts your ability to really like the piece. And so in some cases, people will say, if it didn't have all that, I would buy it, but because it has all that, it's, I'll look for another piece.
Yeah.
But if it's the one and only piece that you have to have, sometimes you have to accept it. Now,
Right.
You can take it to an art restorer, and in some cases they can make it look better. And I think art restoration is actually accepted in this industry. It's not like if you restored a comic book, it would actually in some cases downgrade the value of the comic book because it had been restored. And so they actually note that, and if you get it professionally graded, it'll say restored.
Yeah.
With comic book art, it's it can be restored. Sometimes you won't even be able to notice the difference, but I would say it's a lot more accepted within this hobby because it's about the preservation of the art. It's making sure that if some of the Zipatone was starting to turn a different color and turn the artwork, you don't want the artwork to get damaged.
Aesthetic is always a factor.
Yeah,
right?
and frankly, when they were doing this back in the days, they weren't really thinking about the longevity of it. It was really there to get the publication out that month, and so. It's us collectors that I think are sort of helping to preserve this stuff, and I think and people are incenting that to happen.
One of the things that's jumping out at me about this piece is the fact that it's mounted onto illustration board of some kind. Now, is that original to when the artwork was produced, or that was done later by a collector?
This was done by Tom Palmer, I think, who was the inker at the time. I think he liked to have it on this harder board. Where you'll notice, you can pretty much hold this up, and I think the illustration board is a lot heavier, while this one flops in the wind a little bit.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll actually see it drawn directly on illustration board, which is the thicker board, and sometimes you see it mounted.
Yeah.
I believe this may have been mounted, dry mounted, where they would spray it with some type of glue adhesive and then mount it on the board, but I think it was actually cut. But I think that was his preference of the inker to work on a more stable surface.
Yeah, interesting.
At the time.
Well, that makes sense. So we covered the standard cover. We've talked about the wraparound cover. Any other types of covers in comic art?
I think those are the main two. Sometimes you'll see this is black and white, obviously, but I think there's painted covers as well, which are going to obviously be in full color. Typically, what you're also noticing is that the comic art is, for the most part, black and white, and the color was added later, and we'll go through a bit of the process of how they did that.
Yeah.
But I think these are the main two types.